March 27th, 1944, 18,000 feet above Bordeaux, France. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jägerschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter wings, watched through his reflector sight as three massive American fighters appeared through broken clouds below his formation. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, flying combat air patrol over a retreating bomber stream. Priller had shot down 96 Allied aircraft across 3 years of combat. He had faced Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes over the Channel, P-38 Lightnings over France. Now he rolled his Focke-Wulf FW-190 into a diving attack on what he and his fellow pilots had taken to calling the Amerikanische Panzer with a mixture of respect and mockery. The American tank, too heavy to dogfight properly, too slow to catch a properly flown Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, too cumbersome to pose a real threat to experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Priller had fought them a dozen times. He knew their weaknesses. He pressed his attack with complete confidence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 30 seconds later, Priller's wingman, Lieutenant Hans Hartigs, was dead, his FW-190 transformed into a tumbling fireball by a concentrated burst that seemed to appear from nowhere. Priller himself had 3 20mm cannon shells lodged in his armor plate, his engine streaming coolant, both aileron controls damaged. 2 more pilots from his staffel were limping home with battle damage. The Thunderbolts had barely maneuvered. They had simply turned their noses toward the attacking Germans and opened fire with all 8 50-caliber machine guns simultaneously. What emerged from those guns was not aimed fire in the traditional sense. It was not marksmanship as Priller understood it. It was something entirely new, something the Luftwaffe High Command was only beginning to comprehend with growing alarm. It was concentrated industrial firepower on a scale no single-engine fighter had ever possessed, delivered with mechanical precision that human reflexes alone could never achieve. The Luftwaffe's contempt for the P-47 Thunderbolt had not emerged from ignorance or arrogance. It had developed from reasonable tactical assessment based on observable performance characteristics. When the first P-47 seconds appeared in escort missions over Europe in April 1943, German fighter pilots had analyzed them methodically. The Thunderbolt was enormous, weighing more than 17,000 pounds at maximum takeoff weight. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, by comparison, weighed 10,800 pounds. The legendary Messerschmitt Bf-109G weighed 7,500 pounds. Basic fighter doctrine, developed through 4 years of combat experience, held that lighter aircraft with better power-to-weight ratios would dominate heavier opponents in turning combat. The P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R 2,800 radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. Impressive, certainly. But that power had to move substantially more weight than German designs. In initial engagements during spring and summer of 1943, German pilots found they could often outturn the Thunderbolt in horizontal combat, particularly at lower altitudes where the P-47's turbocharger advantage diminished. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, who would eventually be credited with 102 victories before his death in March 1944, wrote in a tactical report dated July 15, 1943, that would later be captured and studied by American intelligence officers. The new American fighter is formidable in the dive and at high altitude, but its massive weight makes it predictable in close combat. Our pilots are learning to force turning engagements where the Thunderbolt cannot match our maneuverability. The key is to avoid prolonged head-on attacks, where the American can bring his heavy armament to bear. Accept the turning fight, and the advantage is ours. This tactical doctrine, widely distributed through Luftwaffe training units, would prove catastrophically flawed, not because the analysis of the P-47's turning performance was incorrect, but because it fundamentally misunderstood what the Thunderbolt had been designed to do. The P-47 was not built to dogfight, it was built to kill. The distinction would cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of its most experienced pilots. The Republic Aviation Company's design philosophy for the P-47 traced directly to lessons learned from early war combat reports. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief engineer, had studied accounts from the Battle of Britain and early North African campaigns. He recognized that future air combat would increasingly favor firepower and protection over pure agility. The P-47's armament represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. 8 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, each capable of firing between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, depending on altitude and temperature. The standard ammunition load for a P-47D model carried 395 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 267 rounds per gun for the outboard positions, totaling 3,348 rounds. At maximum rate of fire, a P-47 pilot who held his trigger down continuously could maintain fire for approximately 31 seconds before exhausting all ammunition. But those 31 seconds represented something unprecedented in fighter aviation. With all 8 guns firing simultaneously, a Thunderbolt put approximately 115 50 caliber bullets into the air every single second. The mathematics of this firepower were staggering and unprecedented. Each 50 caliber round weighed approximately 1.6 ounces. A single second of sustained fire from all 8 guns put over 7 pounds of metal into the air. The muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second meant these projectiles carried devastating kinetic energy. More importantly, the convergence pattern of the guns, typically set to concentrate fire at 300 yards, created a kill zone approximately 6 feet in diameter, where all 8 streams of bullets intersected. Any aircraft entering that zone faced mathematical certainty of catastrophic damage. German pilots trained on aircraft mounting 2 or 3 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns discovered that engagement geometry had fundamentally changed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the most common German fighter variant in 1944, typically mounted one 30mm Mk 108 cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm Mg 131 machine guns above the engine. The Focke-Wulf FW190A8 carried 2 13mm Mg 131S in the cowling and 4 20mm Mg 151 cannons in the wings. Both configurations delivered devastating hitting power per round. A single 20mm high-explosive shell could destroy critical components or kill a pilot outright. A 30mm round could tear a wing off a fighter or blow a bomber's engine apart. But these weapons had severe limitations that American intelligence officers studying captured aircraft and combat film quickly identified. Rate of fire for the Mk 108 30mm cannon was approximately 600 rounds per minute, limited by the weapon's heavy recoil and complex firing mechanism. The Mg 151 20mm cannon managed approximately 750 rounds per minute. More critically, ammunition capacity was severely restricted by weight considerations. A typical Bf 109 G6 carried 60 rounds for the 30mm cannon, 200 rounds per gun. For the 13mm machine guns, totaling 460 rounds. Sustained fire time was measured in seconds. The pilot had perhaps 4 seconds of cannon fire before exhausting his primary weapon. The tactical implications were profound. German pilots had to close to effective range, typically between 200 and 400 yards, achieve a precise firing solution on a maneuvering target, and deliver their limited ammunition with maximum efficiency. This required exceptional skill, nerves of steel, and perfect timing. It was aerial combat as individual martial art, each engagement a test of personal ability. The Americans had industrialized the problem. A P-47 pilot did not need exceptional marksmanship. He needed only to point his aircraft in the general direction of the enemy and press the trigger. The sheer volume of fire compensated for imperfect aim. The extended ammunition capacity allowed sustained engagement. The mathematical probability of hits approached certainty simply through overwhelming quantity. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would finish the war as the top-scoring American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, all achieved in P-47 seconds, described the psychological transformation this firepower created in a 1946 interview with Army Air Forces historians. Flying a P-47 changed how you thought about combat. In training, they'd taught us deflection, shooting, lead angles, all the marksmanship fundamentals. Then you got into a Thunderbolt with 850s, and you realized you didn't need to be a perfect shot. You needed to get close enough and put enough bullets in the air. The Germans were better individual pilots early in the war, more experienced, better trained, but we had firepower that made up for our inexperience. You didn't need to be an ace to kill a German fighter, you just needed to get him in front of you and pull the trigger. The airplane did the rest. The first large-scale engagement that demonstrated the lethality of concentrated P-47 firepower occurred on January 29, 1944, during a mission to Frankfurt. The 56th Fighter Group, equipped entirely with P-47 seconds and led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, encountered approximately 40 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, attacking a formation of B-17 bombers. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 14 German fighters destroyed with 3 probables and 6 damaged. Post-war examination of Luftwaffe loss records confirmed 11 German aircraft were actually destroyed, an unusual correlation between American claims and verified losses. 3 American P-47 seconds returned with battle damage. None were lost. The intelligence reports filed after this engagement noted a pattern that would become increasingly common. German fighters that survived the initial pass by P-47 seconds frequently broke off and disengaged, rather than continuing the fight. Luftwaffe pilots were discovering that pressing an attack against Thunderbolts meant flying directly into concentrated firepower that could destroy their aircraft in seconds. The psychological pressure of watching tracer rounds converging on your position, knowing that for every visible tracer there were 4 invisible bullets in the stream, knowing that the American pilot could sustain that fire for 30 seconds, while your own ammunition would be exhausted in 4 seconds, created a tactical dilemma with no good solution. Major Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 victories, provided the German perspective in a 1953 interview with American aviation researchers. The P-47's firepower was psychologically devastating. You knew intellectually that you could destroy it with your cannons if you achieved a proper firing solution. But to achieve that solution, you had to fly directly at it while it fired 8 machine guns at you. The volume of tracers coming at you was terrifying. Every instinct screamed to break off, even though breaking off meant failing your mission. The Thunderbolt pilot didn't need exceptional courage. He could sit there firing almost indefinitely, while you had perhaps one good burst before running out of cannon ammunition. The mathematics favored him absolutely. We were fighting American industrial capacity, not American pilots. The spring of 1944 brought the campaign against the Luftwaffe to its climax. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, commenced on February 20th with coordinated attacks on German aircraft production facilities. The Luftwaffe responded with maximum effort, committing hundreds of fighters to defend critical industrial targets. The air battles during this week-long campaign were among the most intense of the entire war. P-47 groups flew multiple missions daily, engaging German fighters in running battles across occupied Europe and Germany proper. The statistics from Big Week revealed the decisive impact of P-47 firepower. Between February 20th and February 25th, American fighters destroyed approximately 520 German aircraft in air combat. Post-war analysis suggests the actual figure was approximately 350 confirmed destroyed. P-47 units accounted for roughly 40% of these victories, despite representing only about 35% of American fighter strength in theater. The destruction was not evenly distributed. Experienced Luftwaffe units suffered disproportionate losses. Jägerschwader 11, one of Germany's elite fighter wings, lost 27 pilots killed in 5 days. Jägerschwader 1, the prestigious unit once commanded by legendary ace Adolf Galland, lost 19 pilots. These were not replaceable losses. These were veterans with hundreds of combat missions, men whose experience and skill had been developed over years of warfare. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline could not replace such losses with pilots of equivalent quality. By March 1944, the average German fighter pilot, arriving at operational units, had approximately 150 hours total flight time, with perhaps 20 hours in their combat aircraft type. American replacement pilots arriving in the same period had approximately 400 hours, with extensive gunnery training. But the critical difference was not training time, it was the aircraft they flew. A mediocre American pilot in a P-47, with 850 caliber machine guns and 3,300 rounds of ammunition, had overwhelming firepower advantage over even an experienced German pilot in a Bf-109 or FW-190 with limited ammunition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical evolution of the P-47 throughout 1944 magnified its already formidable armament. The introduction of the P-47D-25 variant in May brought the bubble canopy configuration, dramatically improving pilot visibility. Being able to see threats earlier meant more opportunities to bring those 8 guns to bear effectively. The P-47M variant, introduced in December 1944 specifically to counter German jet aircraft, retained the 8-gun armament but added significantly more powerful engines and improved high-altitude performance. Even the radical jets like the Messerschmitt Me 262 discovered that their speed advantage meant nothing if they entered the fire cone of a P-47's guns during attack or recovery. The most revealing assessment of the P-47's firepower came not from American sources, but from Luftwaffe tactical directives issued in summer 1944. A captured document dated July 18, 1944, distributed to all Luftwaffe fighter units in the West, provided explicit guidance for engaging American fighters. The directive, which American intelligence designated Document 2447K, stated in clinical technical language what German pilots had learned through brutal experience. Engagement with the Republic P-47 requires maximum caution. The aircraft carries exceptionally heavy armament consisting of 8 heavy machine guns with extensive ammunition capacity. Pilots must avoid head-on attacks where the enemy can bring full firepower to bear. Recommended tactics include high-speed diving attacks from above and behind, firing brief bursts and immediately breaking away. Extended engagements are strongly discouraged. The enemy's ammunition capacity permits sustained fire that will eventually achieve hits through probability alone. This directive represented complete abandonment of the aggressive tactics that had served the Luftwaffe well earlier in the war. German pilots were being instructed to avoid prolonged combat with an enemy fighter. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe morale was significant and measurable. Captain Robert L. Shoup of the 359th Fighter Group wrote in an after-action report dated August 9, 1944, capturing an observation that numerous American pilots recorded during this period. German pilots are increasingly reluctant to engage. We observe them positioning for attacks but breaking off when we turn toward them. Their tactics suggest they fear our firepower more than they trust their aircraft's performance advantages. On multiple occasions, enemy fighters with superior position have disengaged rather than pressing attacks. This represents a fundamental shift from earlier in the year when German pilots routinely accepted combat regardless of circumstances. The material evidence supported these observations. Technical examination of destroyed German aircraft recovered from crash sites revealed that many had been hit by remarkable numbers of 50 caliber rounds. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 shot down near Metz on September 14, 1944, recovered intact enough for detailed analysis, showed evidence of 63 separate 50 caliber impacts distributed across the fuselage, wings, and tail surfaces. The concentration of hits on the left wing and fuselage suggested the attacking P-47 had fired a sustained burst, while the German pilot attempted a diving turn to escape. The FW-190's structural failure occurred when this accumulated damage caused the left wing spar to fracture under G-loading during the evasive maneuver. The pilot never had opportunity to bail out. This single example illustrated the lethality of sustained fire from multiple 50-caliber guns. The German pilot had not been struck by a single catastrophic hit. He had been destroyed by accumulated damage from dozens of individual rounds, each of which by itself might not have been fatal, but which collectively made the aircraft unflyable. This was industrial warfare translated into aerial combat. The P-47 was not a precision instrument. It was a mass-production killing machine designed to destroy enemy aircraft through overwhelming firepower. The human cost of this firepower was enormous and precisely documented. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 4,700 pilots killed in action on all fronts, with roughly 2,800 of these losses occurring over Western Europe and Germany. American fighters accounted for approximately 65% of these air-to-air losses. P-47 units, despite being gradually supplemented and partially replaced by P-51 Mustangs beginning in spring 1944, continued to account for a disproportionate share of German fighters destroyed. The reason was mathematical and unavoidable. The P-47's 8-gun armament gave it higher probability of kill per engagement than any other Allied fighter. Technical analysis, conducted by the Army Air Force's Operational Analysis Section in late 1944, examined gun camera footage from successful engagements. The study, which analyzed 463 confirmed victories achieved by P-47 seconds between March and October 1944, revealed consistent patterns. The average firing pass lasted between 1.8 and 3.4 seconds. The average range at which fire was opened was 380 yards. The average range when fire ceased was 190 yards. The average ammunition expenditure per victory was 427 rounds, or 13% of total capacity. These statistics revealed the efficiency of the P-47's armament system. A pilot did not need to exhaust his ammunition to achieve kills. Brief, concentrated bursts at medium range were sufficient to destroy or critically damage German fighters. The killing mechanism was consistent across hundreds of examples. The high volume of 50-caliber fire would simultaneously hit multiple critical systems. Engine cooling systems would be punctured, fuel lines would be severed, control cables would be cut, structural members would be weakened. Any single hit might be survivable. The combination of multiple hits occurring within seconds was not. German aircraft that survived initial damage frequently experienced catastrophic structural failure when pilots attempted evasive maneuvers, as the accumulated damage had weakened airframes beyond their design limits. The psychological burden this placed on Luftwaffe pilots was captured in personal letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, who survived the war with 197 victories, described the experience in a 1978 interview. When you saw Thunderbolts, you knew you were facing an opponent with overwhelming firepower advantage. The smart move was to disengage and look for easier targets, bombers without fighter escort, isolated stragglers. But we couldn't always disengage. Our orders were to attack the bombers. That meant going through the escort. And the escort meant Thunderbolts with those 8 guns. You would position for your attack run, commit to the diving pass, and suddenly the air would be full of tracers. You didn't dogfight with them. You made one pass, fired, and got out. Stay, and fight. And you were dead. The final accounting of the P-47's combat effectiveness came in the destruction of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force during 1944 and early 1945. By January 1945, German fighter strength had declined to approximately 1,500 operational aircraft on all fronts, down from approximately 3,900 aircraft in January 1944. Pilot quality had deteriorated catastrophically. Many frontline Luftwaffe pilots in early 1945 had fewer than 50 hours in type. They were flying against American pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience and overwhelming material advantages. The outcome was predetermined. The final major air battle involving significant P-47 participation occurred on April 17, 1945, when approximately 150 American fighters encountered approximately 200 German aircraft over Dresden. The engagement lasted 43 minutes. American forces claimed 71 German aircraft destroyed. Post-war examination confirmed 59 actual German losses. American losses totaled 3 aircraft. The exchange ratio of roughly 20-1 was typical of late-war air combat. The Luftwaffe had ceased to be an effective fighting force. It had been destroyed not primarily by numerical superiority, though numbers certainly mattered, but by a combination of factors that included training, tactics, and critically, firepower. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns had been instrumental in that destruction. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of Germany's fighter forces, provided the definitive assessment in his post-war memoir, written in 1953. The American fighter development philosophy, particularly exemplified by the P-47, focused on survivability and firepower rather than performance optimization. This approach proved devastatingly effective. Our pilots faced opponents who could absorb significant battle damage and return fire with overwhelming weight of bullets. The psychological effect was corrosive. Our most experienced pilots grew cautious. Our inexperienced pilots were slaughtered. By mid-1944, we had lost air superiority, not because our aircraft were inferior in performance, though the Americans certainly had excellent machines, but because their firepower made every engagement a calculated risk we could not afford. Every combat was Russian roulette. Eventually, the mathematics caught up with us. The legacy of the P-47's armament philosophy extended far beyond World War II. The principle of overwhelming firepower as the primary air superiority weapon influenced American fighter design for decades. The F-86 Sabre that dominated Korean skies mounted 650 caliber machine guns. The F-4 Phantom, initially deployed to Vietnam without an internal gun, a decision based on missile primacy theories that proved disastrously wrong. Combat experience forced installation of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon, capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute, a direct descendant of the P-47's firepower-centric philosophy. Modern fighters like the F-15 Eagle and F-22 Raptor continue this tradition, mounting internal cannons as backup weapons despite primary reliance on missiles. The technical specifications tell the story in numbers. The 8-gun armament of the P-47 represented approximately 115 rounds per second of sustained fire. The M61 Vulcan represents 100 rounds per second. The improvement in individual projectile lethality and accuracy systems has been dramatic, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Air superiority requires the ability to destroy enemy aircraft rapidly through overwhelming firepower. The P-47 proved this principle in the most demanding testing ground imaginable, combat against the world's most experienced fighter pilots, flying excellent aircraft. The principle has remained valid across 80 years of continuous evolution in fighter design. The human dimension of this transformation deserves final consideration. The 850 caliber guns of the P-47 were not abstract technical specifications. They were instruments that killed thousands of young men, many of them exceptionally skilled and courageous, fighting for a cause that history rightly judged evil, but which they believed to be honorable. The German pilots who died in front of P-47 guns were not monsters. They were young men who loved flying, who protected their comrades, who showed remarkable courage in impossible circumstances. The American pilots who killed them were equally young, equally brave, equally convinced of their cause. The difference was not moral character. The difference was industrial capacity translated into firepower. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed approximately 3,800 German aircraft in air-to-air combat during World War II, more than any other Allied fighter except the P-51 Mustang. These victories came at the cost of approximately 1,700 P-47 seconds lost in combat, an exchange ratio of better than 2-1. But the true measure of the P-47's impact was not in exchange ratios. It was in psychological dominance. German pilots learned to fear the Thunderbolt not because it was faster or more maneuverable than their aircraft, but because it carried firepower they could not match and could not survive against for extended engagements. That fear changed their tactics, reduced their aggressiveness, and ultimately contributed to their defeat. The contempt Luftwaffe pilots initially felt for the massive American fighter had transformed into respect, then caution, then fear. They had learned through bitter experience that the P-47's 8 guns were not a weakness to exploit but a weapon system that made every engagement a potentially lethal gamble. They had discovered that American engineering philosophy, which seemed inefficient and crude to pilots raised on elegant, lightweight European designs, was actually ruthlessly effective. The Americans had not built the best dogfighter. They had built the most effective killer. The distinction decided the air war over Europe. In the end, the Luftwaffe's laughter at the P-47 Thunderbolt had died in the throats of pilots who watched their comrades disintegrate under streams of 50 caliber fire they could neither avoid nor return effectively. The laughter had been replaced by tactical directives warning against prolonged engagement, by cautious approaches and rapid disengagements, by the slow recognition that the war in the air was lost not to superior skill or courage, but to superior firepower and industrial capacity. The 850 caliber machine guns of the P-47 had not just destroyed 200 German formations, though they certainly had done that and more. They had destroyed the Luftwaffe's will to fight, its confidence in victory, its belief that skill and courage could overcome material disadvantage. The young Americans who flew those massive fighters, many of them barely old enough to vote, had participated in one of the most decisive technological and tactical triumphs in military aviation history. They had proven that in modern aerial warfare, firepower trumped agility, that industrial capacity could overwhelm individual skill, and that the ability to put more bullets in the air faster than your opponent could determine the outcome of not just individual engagements, but entire campaigns. The P-47 had not been designed to dance gracefully through the sky. It had been designed to destroy enemy aircraft efficiently and return its pilots safely home. In that mission, it succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, becoming one of the most effective fighter aircraft of the Second World War and establishing design principles that continue to influence military aviation 8 decades later. The technical evolution of American gunnery doctrine specifically for the P-47 represented a parallel revolution to the aircraft's firepower itself. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, Army Air Force's training programs underwent fundamental transformation based on combat reports from Europe. The traditional emphasis on precise marksmanship, inherited from decades of pursuit aviation doctrine, gave way to new techniques that maximized the P-47's unique advantages. At Pinecastle Army Airfield in Florida and Ajo Auxiliary Field in Arizona, gunnery instructors developed training programs specifically designed for P-47 pilots. These programs emphasized principles that would have seemed heretical to fighter pilots from earlier eras. Students learned to open fire at ranges previously considered excessive, exploiting the P-47's abundant ammunition capacity. They practiced sustained bursts rather than brief trigger squeezes, trusting that volume of fire would compensate for imperfect aim. Most importantly, they trained extensively in deflection shooting against high-speed crossing targets, the exact scenario most commonly encountered in combat against German fighters making slashing attacks on bomber formations. Lieutenant Colonel Cass Huff, who commanded advanced gunnery training at Pinecastle from March through September 1944, explained the philosophy in a training manual he authored that was distributed throughout the Fighter Training Command. The P-47 pilot's advantage is not in aerial acrobatics, but in the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower during brief firing opportunities. German pilots are highly skilled in evasive maneuvering. They will not remain in your sights for extended periods. Therefore, the successful P-47 pilot must be able to deliver maximum effective fire during windows of opportunity, lasting 1 to 3 seconds. This requires abandoning the traditional focus on a perfect sight picture and instead developing the ability to track the target's flight path and lead it sufficiently to place a stream of bullets through the space it will occupy. This training emphasis produced measurable results in combat effectiveness. Statistical analysis of gun camera footage from P-47 squadrons showed clear improvement over time as pilots trained under the new doctrine entered combat. In early 1943, when most P-47 pilots had received traditional gunnery training, the average rounds expended per victory was approximately 950. By mid-1944, with pilots trained specifically for P-47 tactics, this figure had declined to approximately 427 rounds per victory. The improvement represented not just better marksmanship, but better understanding of how to employ the P-47's armament system effectively. The introduction of the K-14 gun sight in late 1944 provided technological enhancement to the firepower advantage. This gyroscopic lead computing sight, developed from captured German technology and refined by American engineers, automatically calculated the correct lead angle for deflection shots based on target wingspan and range. The pilot simply kept the reticle on the target, adjusted the range dial, and the sight computed the necessary deflection. Combined with the P-47's 8-gun armament, the K-14 transformed even average pilots into effective killers. Captain William O'Brien of the 361st Fighter Group, one of the first pilots to use the K-14 sight in combat in December 1944, described its impact in a letter to his brother that was later published in his unit's history. The new sight is revolutionary. You can track a German fighter pulling hard, evasive maneuvers, keep the pipper on him, and watch your tracers arc perfectly into his flight path. Combined with the Jug's 850s, it's almost unfair. I shot down 2 109 seconds yesterday in attacks that would have been nearly impossible with the old sight. Both were pulling maximum G turns trying to evade. The K-14 computed the lead automatically. I just followed the pipper and pressed the trigger. Both went down with multiple strikes center mass. The Germans don't have a counter to this technology. The German response to the P-47's firepower advantage evolved throughout 1944, revealing the extent to which American armament had forced fundamental tactical changes. Luftwaffe fighter units increasingly adopted hit-and-run tactics that minimized exposure to return fire. The classic diving attack from high altitude, firing a brief burst, and diving away without attempting to turn with the Americans, became standard procedure. This tactical adjustment, while reducing German losses somewhat, also reduced effectiveness against the bombers they were tasked with stopping. German Fighter Tactics Manual Tactical Instructions for Fighter Units in Combat Against Four-Engine Bombers and Their Escorts, issued in August 1944 and captured when Luftwaffe headquarters at Diehl was overrun in April 1945, contained specific passages addressing the P-47 threat. The document, translated by Allied intelligence, stated with remarkable candor the challenge German pilots faced. The Republic P-47 combines heavy protective armor with exceptionally powerful armament. Engagement should be undertaken only when tactical advantage is decisive, preferably altitude and position superiority, with clear escape route. Head-on attacks are especially dangerous due to the enemy's ability to concentrate fire from 8 heavy machine guns. Pilots must resist the temptation to engage in turning combat, where the enemy's superior ammunition capacity becomes decisive. Attack aggressively but disengage immediately. Prolonged combat favors the enemy absolutely. This defensive posture represented complete reversal from the aggressive tactics that had characterized Luftwaffe operations in 1940 through early 1943. The Luftwaffe had been transformed from hunter to hunted, not primarily through numerical inferiority, though numbers certainly mattered, but through firepower disparity that made every engagement dangerous, even when German pilots held tactical advantage. The psychological burden of knowing that a single mistake would likely prove fatal, that the enemy could sustain fire while your ammunition exhausted after seconds, that the Americans could absorb battle damage that would destroy your aircraft, eroded the offensive spirit that had made the Luftwaffe formidable in earlier campaigns. The ground attack role for which the P-47 became famous in the final year of the war also benefited enormously from the 8-gun armament. While the aircraft gained renown for its ability to deliver bombs and rockets against German armor and transportation, the 50 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective against softer targets. A single P-47, making a strafing pass on a German supply column or troop concentration could place over 1,000 rounds on target in a 10-second attack. The psychological impact on German ground forces was severe and well documented in captured documents and post-war interviews. Major Hans von Luck, who commanded a panzer regiment in Normandy during the summer of 1944, described the impact of P-47 attacks in his memoir published in 1989. The Jarbos, as we called Allied fighter bombers, made daylight movement nearly impossible. The P-47 seconds were particularly feared because of their heavy gun armament. A typical attack would begin with rockets or bombs against vehicles, followed by sustained strafing runs with their 8 machine guns. The volume of fire was incredible. They could make multiple passes because they carried so much ammunition. I witnessed a single P-47 attack, a column of trucks on the road to Caen. The aircraft made 3 separate strafing passes. By the time it departed, every vehicle was destroyed or burning. The psychological effect on survivors was profound. Men became reluctant to move during daylight, knowing that any movement invited attack from aircraft that seemed to have inexhaustible ammunition. The destruction of the Falaise pocket in August 1944 demonstrated the P-47's ground attack capabilities on a massive scale. As German forces attempted to escape encirclement, Allied fighter bombers, including substantial numbers of P-47 seconds, subjected them to continuous attack. The narrow roads through the gap became killing grounds. Gun camera footage from P-47 seconds attacking during this period shows the devastating effect of 850 caliber guns on concentrated vehicles and troops. Trucks disintegrated under sustained fire. Tanks, while largely immune to 50 caliber penetration, were rendered immobile when vision blocks, antennas, and external equipment were destroyed. Horses, still extensively used by the Wehrmacht for logistics, were slaughtered in hundreds. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the Falaise pocket, with thousands more wounded. While artillery and ground forces certainly contributed to this destruction, fighter bomber attacks, particularly by P-47 seconds with their heavy armament, accounted for a substantial portion of casualties. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors influenced German military performance for the remainder of the war. Units that had experienced Allied air superiority became extremely cautious about movement, reducing operational effectiveness even when numerical strength remained adequate for their missions. The Pacific Theater provided an important counterpoint to the European experience with P-47 firepower. P-47 seconds operated in the Pacific from mid-1943 onward, eventually equipping numerous fighter groups. The tactical environment differed substantially from Europe. Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi Zero and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar prioritized maneuverability over protection and firepower. They were far lighter than German fighters, more agile, but also far more vulnerable to battle damage. Against these opponents, the P-47's 8-gun armament proved even more devastating than in Europe. Japanese fighters that might survive hits from lighter-armed American aircraft disintegrated when struck by concentrated 50 caliber fire. The structural fragility of Japanese designs, optimized for maximum performance from limited horsepower, made them exceptionally vulnerable to the P-47's firepower. Combat reports from Pacific P-47 units consistently noted that Japanese fighters required fewer hits to destroy than German aircraft. A burst that might damage a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf enough to drive it from combat would typically destroy a Zero outright. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.